Hello and welcome. Today, Kristen and I are going to be talking about Hecuba or Hecate, who was the wife of the king of Troy during its mythic fall when it was attacked by the Greeks over Queen Helen and so on. It's a complicated story. We're going to get a little bit into the story in a few minutes, but what we really wanted to discuss was this bit of the mythology around Hecuba. I think I'll use the Latin Hecuba. Hecuba, where after something horrible happens and she is justifiably outraged and acts accordingly, that in one of the versions, I think multiple versions of this story that's told, she turns into a dog. And this dog is a very, very special dog. And the dog is like a priestess or attendant of Hecate.
Mm-hmm.
And this really, I know it captures your attention too. Like it completely captivates me. Like, why would Euripides and later like Ovid, why when they were telling this story, would this happen to Hecuba at the end of her very sorrowful, tragic, horrible story? She gets turned into a dog, and the dog is like an attendant priestess of Hecate.
Yeah.
Thoughts? I know
Was
you
it
have.
Mercy?
I know you have a lot of thoughts on this.
No, I do. I have a lot of thoughts on this. Do you think it was Mercy? And there are different variations of the ending. I think it could have been Mercy.
I do think it was Mercy, and of course, we can't put ourselves into the imagination of Euripides writing 2,500 years ago. Like, of course, but we can kind of explore who he was and what the culture was like at that time and why this end for a noble queen, a good queen, a benevolent queen. She was not evil or mean or any of these things. She, like a horrible fate befell her that was largely outside of her purview. And yet at the end of her life, instead of, I don't know, becoming like one of the many other creatures that in Greek mythology, people get turned into, she became a dog. So we're going to talk more about our thoughts on that in a few minutes. So maybe we should get started with just a bit of a warning. If you are here joining us for this conversation about Hecate, Hecate, or Hecuba, that this is a really difficult story with really, really horrible and upsetting aspects to it. We are going to try to reclaim Hecuba from this story and find her wisdom and power and restore her to her throne. But if you're not feeling up to a story that has lots of horribleness in it, you might want to sit this one out. So let's light our candle and start to explore Hecuba. So one of the big themes with Hecuba, of course, is powerlessness. She goes from being powerful to powerless.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're feeling a little bit powerless, let's begin by just releasing any feelings of powerlessness. And then let's cast the circle around us, protecting us, and also empowering us. I think that is the energy that we want to go into this discussion with. I found a really, really beautiful poem written by a Greek poet that I'm going to read for our invocation. So this is Hecuba by Griva Anna, and the translation is by Marcos Dendrinos. Since I was a young girl, tear was boiled in my chest, as well as blood, and my mind was full of trees and hanged. My mother was saying that this is due to my name, as it only differed a little from that of dark Hecate. The name was a fault, so they called me Fresh Branch, Gentle Breeze, and Smell of Meadows. For years not called, I had forgotten. But when I rose one morning, I existed partly, and myself was shouting, "Who are you? Who are you?" Then, as enchanted, I answered to my insides, "I am Hecuba. Hecuba, prey of myself, worker of the earthly. Hide and seek is my fate, a vessel smashed. I am Hecuba." And the goddess rose, assuming that I had called her my chosen. She told me the letter does not save you. I waited for your word, for the whole catching you. So Troy was seized as the goddess's teeth gapped mad, your walls and homes in that day it was raining spells. I find this poem really intrigues me. What's your reaction to this poem?
To me, if you learn about the story of Hecuba, it's about a reclaiming of like divine rage and finding like I don't know, sort of owning grief. Sorry, I have to cough.
So owning grief, like, and I really like how the author is making a play on that Hecuba and Hecate, like kind of in the English version of the Greek, and in the Greek, it's Hecabe and Hecate. Literally, it's just B and T that are different. B in Greek is beta, the second letter of the alphabet, and then T is tau. Um, and it's interesting, like, again, if we're trying to imagine what was going through Euripides' head when he was concocting this story, or even who the original author that he adapted from might have been, like, this idea that there's only one letter difference between Hecuba and Hecate, that she is this just and wise queen who suffers horribly. And in this poem, it's that she remembers one day, that she is one letter different from Hecate, and she too has that primordial power, and she really seizes it towards the end of her story in a way that is like terrifying to her captors. Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to tell a little bit, very truncated version of the story of the fall of Troy, told, as I've mentioned before, by Euripides and others throughout history. It remains very popular. In ancient art, the play was incredibly popular. The importance of Euripides' writings about the fall of Troy to ancient Greece, like everything that I've read about this, that these plays were a story that kind of described what was happening in Greece. So even though I think scholars mostly think that Troy was not a real place, this may have been inspired by events that really happened, but the story of the Iliad, where Troy, this is also told, all of this is largely like, it's a story that may be based by, on some historical events. But Euripides was trying to explain to his fellow Greeks, again, speaking largely to men, because it's debated whether, like, all women could really even go to the theater at certain parts. It's a complicated discussion, but he was speaking to other men. When they say, he was speaking to other Greeks, they mean other men who were citizens. And that, this is the terrible thing that can happen, and there is a real cost to this. And the way in his plays that he talks about what happened to the women is what captures my attention. So there was a real, like, when we look at public figures today who kind of write in ways that are commenting on the larger political discourse. Like, I think the popularity of the musical Hamilton would be like a modern analog to this, don't you think, Kristen?
Mm-hmm.
So that just to kind of contextualize how important this, like the different plays about the Trojan War and the art and so on. So I've mentioned Euripides many times. He indeed wrote 2 plays talking about the Trojan War. I didn't put up anything from the Iliad. I think most of us are familiar with the Iliad, and if not, there's a new translation that I highly recommend, and we have it here. It's a really good translation. So Hecuba's sorrow, and this is where we really want to land on this idea of sorrow and mercy and empathy. I'll read these. I love this quote where she says, I am dead. Sorrow has forestalled death here. Like, Kristen, have you ever felt like that? Like, I can't die now because I am so distraught. There is no way I could die.
In a sense, I think I have. And I was talking to you about this earlier. Like, I have definitely been in a point in my life where I fell into a sort of primal state of grief. That became, I don't know, it's like it maybe primal is the key word. Like, it just overtook me. Like when
Right.
you just like fall to the floor and just, it's fall into something greater than yourself. Like I don't even know how to explain it. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Right. It's the aliveness of grief.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I think we typically more think of like the aliveness of love, but grief, for anybody who's been in the depths of grief, um, like it is alive. That doesn't mean it's pleasant, it's horrible, but it's alive and it can consume us. So I'm going to read a little bit of her lament from Euripides' play Hecuba. O grief, what can I say? What are the words for loss? Of bitterness of age, slavery not to be borne, unendurable. To whom can I turn? Childless and homeless, my husband murdered, my city stained with fire. Where can I go? Where shall I find safety? What God, what power will help me now? I don't know. I have had moments like when I felt like that.
Yeah.
And I was journaling about Hecuba this morning. And I just had this sensation that, like, this is my deepest fear, to become like Hecuba in this part of the story, to be completely like disenthroned, to have all the people you love dead, to be completely at the mercy of the state, to be homeless, penniless. Like, for me, that represents my greatest fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what power there is in those words, because it's a way for me to explore my greatest fear
Mm-hmm.
instead of denying that it exists, because I think it's quite rational to have that fear. To be, nobody wants to be this, like Hecuba at this part of her story. We all would like to be Hecuba early in the story, when she's married to Priam and they have wonderful children and the kingdom is good and life is wonderful. And maybe we might want to be Hecuba at the end of this story, the versions where she becomes this like torch dog attendant of Hecate, but like the misery that she goes through. Some more about, so let's get deeper into what actually happened, the details of the story, and then we'll go into the bit of the story that fascinates us, which is this association with Hecuba and Hecate. Okay, so this is from the other play by Euripides about the Trojan women, which is actually called the Trojan Women. Sworn to bring back the hated Helen, the cursed wife of Menelaus, Sparta's shame and Castor's ruin, her whose sin struck down Priam, patriarch of 50 sons, wrecked my life and left me stranded in despairing. Okay, so Helen of Troy, who was Hecuba's daughter-in-law, is actually the villain in this story in many ways, but not an intentional villain. But in some versions, she is quite the conniving creature who plots and schemes, right? Like, but generally, my take on it is that Helen genuinely loved Hecuba's long lost but returned son, Paris. And Helen left her husband, Menelaus, for Paris. And this is what started the whole thing. So things happen. So there is the Trojan War, and Troy falls. You may have heard about the Trojan horse and all of that business. So we're not going to do a huge overview of that. There's a show that I would recommend, which is called The Fall of Troy. That's on Netflix. It's a BBC One production, and it's actually really interesting, and I would recommend watching that. I know there was that Brad Pitt movie called Troy, but don't bother watching that, just for the pure reason that they actually eliminated the character of Hecuba from that movie. We could do a whole conversation about why Hecuba, like, like you can't have an older woman in Hollywood, like, talk about that invisibility. Yeah, have you heard about that? Like, older actors saying that because as they're women in Hollywood, like, once they get older, they can't get good jobs.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, well, we just solved that problem because we have Brad Pitt, so we wrote out one of the most important characters in the whole story.
Right.
And the one character who kind of survives the whole story is Hecuba. Mm-hmm. Everybody else is dead. Mm-hmm. On the Trojan side. Okay. So this is Ovid's Metamorphoses. So with the Metamorphoses of Ovid, he is writing after the Greeks. He's writing after Euripides and talking about all of it. So he's adapting all of these earlier works. And his passage on kind of the aftermath of the fall of Troy for poor Hecuba is really, really, I kind of wanted to read the whole thing, and then I was like, well, that's going to take like an hour, but I pulled out a few passages. So what you need to know is that Troy has fallen. Priam, Hecuba's husband, is dead. Most of their children are dead. The children of their children have been slaughtered. The Greeks have been ruthless, as they were in their slaughter of Hecuba's whole family, but all of the Trojans, not just the, kind of the royal family. Hecuba has been captured, and along with some surviving princesses, and then it comes to, I think it was her last surviving daughter. Right, that's right, isn't it, Christen? Her last surviving daughter.
Was Cassandra her last surviving daughter?
Oh,
or
maybe
Polyxena is.
So this is the Polyxena scene that I pulled from. And this is the business with Polyxena. It just pushes Hecuba over the edge in Ovid's retelling of this story. So Hecuba, when anger mixed with grief, forgot her years, but not her bravery. That is such a good line, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And went directly to the Thracian king. For this cruel murder had been his idea, and asked him for an audience, pretending that she would give him gold that she had long kept hidden for her son. Deceived by this and by his customary avarice, the king came in secret and implored her thus: "Give your son the treasure now, Hecuba, for everything you give will go to him, as everything you've got so far given has. I swear by all the gods, which is he's being mean. Like, it means that any riches that Hecuba or her sons have go to the Greeks. It's not going to the Trojans. She stared at him. And then I kind of passed it through. So Hecuba has been pushed too far. He's taunting her now. He's killed Polyxena. Like, she has just gone too far. He has gone too far. She has nothing left to lose. And she has remembered her bravery and forgotten her years. So she kills him, and it's particularly gory, I think, in most of the versions. In this version, she claws his eyes out.
Mm-hmm.
And after this happens, of course, the Greeks start to kill Hecuba by stoning her and throwing spears at her. And when this is happening, this is the passage that I find so stirring. Growling, she snapped at the stones they threw at her, and even though her jaws were meant for words, she started barking when she attempted speech. Because of this, the place has taken and still takes its name from the place where Hecuba, remembering the evils of that distant time, would howl across the Thracian grasslands mournfully. So others wept, and then this is just another excerpt. So others wept while Hecuba was barking, but Aurora was intent on her own grief. And even to this day, she sheds her tears, the morning dew that falls upon the world. So Hecuba's final grief and rage was anger. It was primal. She was transformed into a dog, and she barked and growled. And I think that is so contradictory to social norms of women at the time, and even social norms today about how we are supposed to grieve. It's just, I know that really stirs me. That whole passage of the sorrows of Hecuba and of its metamorphoses really does something to me. Okay, so I think we've covered most of what I wanted to talk about in terms of like setting the stage for the Trojan War. Is there anything else that you want to bring up about what was going on, like the whole thing with the Trojan War?
No, not necessarily, unless I kind of just, can we go back and just recap the story briefly?
Yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
So Hecuba, this queen of Troy, right? During the Trojan War, all of her children are killed. This king, kills her son. They slaughter her daughter as an offering to Achilles. And it's the king that Cyndi referenced in the slide earlier previously, the one that she clawed his eyes out. So she calls him to her and says, I have this gold. And he comes. So she blinds him and kills his children in retribution. And so there's something there for me about and keep in mind also, like, she's enslaved, her whole family's been enslaved, like there's something there about this primal thing that happens, like, and comparing her to a dog, like if when you're backed into a wall, and it's kind of like women suffering the violence of this war and like fighting back, like when I brought up righteous rage, and like it's almost like this sort of the power in grief, like the fighting back is what's really, like, what am I trying to say? It's like
It really comes through in this story, and you can see how maybe when Euripides was recording this play, and later certainly when Ovid was writing about it, that they were seeing like this. We're going to talk more about the dog business in a bit, but like turning her into a dog, it was like this return to the savage and the wild in some aspects, like the howling, growling dog. Like, this is not like man's best friend. This is like a fearsome beast. And I mean, I think about that a lot in terms of this story, especially like how the Greeks viewed foreigners, for lack of a better word. So how the Greeks would have viewed the Trojans, that they were kind of savage and, potentially not like, they weren't like them. So there was always this kind of wildness in the Greeks when they were conquering lands, where they saw the ones that were defeated, where they kind of came and took over in such horrific ways. Like the people who remained, they really just saw them as animals anyway. Like they weren't humans. They didn't have rights or anything like that. They weren't Greek. And then being women, of course, they were disempowered even more. So, I mean, this comparison with the dog, it makes a lot of sense. And I just wanted to briefly, I guess, just add a little bit more about how important the story of the Trojan War was to the Greeks and to the Romans. So, that this was a parable that was told as kind of a cautionary tale. And interestingly, the Romans actually claimed that they were the descendants of Trojans that survived this mythic war. And there's a story, Aeneas and his family fled Troy and went on to found Rome. So it's really interesting, like this tension between the Greeks and the Romans, like all of this. There is so much that is rooted in this fable of Troy. It's like there's so much to it. And like you said, everybody gets murdered in it. And only Hecuba survives to the end of the story and then becomes a dog. It's really fascinating. Okay, so just let's to recap. I wanted to put up a couple of things in this really amazing play called Trojan Barbie that I ran across in my research. There are actually YouTube videos on Trojan Barbie. So I wanted to give a shout out because I watched some of the performance of this play, and anyway, if you're interested in it, watch it. You won't. It's fascinating. Just to kind of situate the family tree. So Polyxena, Cassandra, she was the one who became a prophet to Apollo and couldn't lie, and then she ended up dead. I think, Kristen, you should just be like, and she ended up dead, and she ended up dead. Andromache, who was the wife of Hector, Hector also ended up dead. So Hector was the son of Priam and Hecuba. Cassandra, Polyxena, Paris, and then Paris marries this Helen. And these are the key players in the myth and also in this really cool play. And what are some of the big themes that we can kind of extrapolate, whether it's from this Trojan Barbie or what does Hecuba and all of the female characters, what do they represent? And we're focusing on Hecuba today, although we could do conversations on Helen, on Cassandra, on Polyxena, on Clytemnestra, on Iphigenia. There's so many female characters in this story that we could talk about. But I really liked this quote. Hecuba represents an interesting construction of ancient womanhood. She is a diplomat, a matriarch, and the glue that holds the Trojan women together. Against a backdrop of the complete subversion of normalcy, which includes the loss of two of her children, Hecuba crumbles. Similarly, Hecuba's daughter-in-law, Andromache, mentions that she has done everything right in her role as a wife, but yet she still faces the terrors and trauma of a world that is shattering around you. That really has a lot of weight for me. And I don't want to slide over this kind of deeper message of Hecuba's trajectory, that even when we do everything right in life, something can happen that is largely beyond our control. Yeah. That sets our life on a course that we can be really powerless over. And that's to me, there's so many deeply frightening aspects of Hecuba that I do see her as a spirit that we can like explore our own fears
Mhm.
in a way that's safe. I feel like, if we were having a conversation with Hecuba, she would be like, yeah, these fears make sense. Look at what happened to me, but just talk about them, which I think is a hallmark of empathy. Like, let's talk about
Yeah.
our fears. I don't
Yeah.
know, Kristen, what do you think? What do you, all these fears? We said it was difficult coming into this conversation. Hecuba is just, we're, all the things that we're terrified of.
Yeah, it is. And it's also it's kind of difficult to put into words when you're dealing with like these big emotions and like yeah. Uh yeah, I'm struggling. I'm struggling, Cyndi.
Well, I'm
Um
just thinking about like, I don't know, I've had some experiences in life when life has gotten pretty shitty. Like life has kicked me to the curb.
yeah.
And fortunately, like my fate was not like Hecuba's, all is well now. But I'm just thinking about how in our society that's not something we talk about openly,
Right.
but it's something that happens to almost everybody, no matter how devoted you are to Hecate, no matter how witchy you are, no matter how like how good you try to be,
Hmm.
that sometimes your son brings Helena Troy home, like I mean in a metaphorical sense. Um and then your whole world is on fire.
Hmm. I think what I was trying to get around to is I'm not trying to say don't have hope,
Right.
but I am gonna say that, and a lot of times we don't face like the harsh reality of things, or it's something that we shy away from. It's something that we turn away from. That like everything can completely fall apart, just all the way apart. You know.
All the way. And I think holding space for that, like it's not to be, like you said, I'm so glad you mentioned hope, because it's not to be pessimistic. It's to say, this has happened to me before in life.
Mhm.
This is a thing that happens. And to a certain extent, we're all at the mercy of the fates.
Yeah.
So let's be hopeful. Let's be wise. Let's live our lives to the fullest,
Mhm.
because sooner or later, I mean, even to me, this links up to my fear of death. Like
Mhm.
sooner or later, these things will come for us all. So let's like live our lives. And also, let's have empathy for each other, because
Yeah.
we're all in this situation together.
Yeah.
That for all of the robustness of life, there is an equal fragility to life.
Mhm.
And I just think that's so powerful. It's such a powerful lesson to learn. But it's
Mhm.
not, I don't think Hecuba is a hopeless spirit. I think she's just a spirit that says things can go really wrong. And, facing our fears is a way to prepare for them and to
Mhm.
understand our past trauma. And I think
Mhm.
she is an ally that can help us work through our own trauma, because she had so much trauma in her life.
Mhm.
So I briefly mentioned this show from BBC before. Here is the Trojan family tree, according to this BBC miniseries that you can watch on Netflix. So you can see there are, I just wanted to demonstrate this. Like Hecuba had a great life. Priam treated her as his equal. And to the Greeks, to Euripides writing about this and so on, this would have been really foreign as well. Like, that she was Priam's equal in every way. And they had children. The kingdom was wealthy and all was good until Paris brought Helen home. I am the mother of sons, and I hope no, neither of them ever bring Helena Troy to the house. Just to make a little bit light of this. Okay, so here's the article I found. I love it when I find these obscure scholarly articles that talk about exactly what you and I want to talk about when we go on one of our like ancient history indulgences and talk about this very specific aspect of this big long epic tale that fascinates us. So Hecate the dog, this is an older article from about 30 years ago, but this is a great article, Kristen, and it just talks so much about why Hecuba was turned into a dog in the myth. So it talks about Hecate, who Hecate was, her association with dogs, and so on. So I guess we should start at the beginning. Historically, Hecate's most sacred animal was the dog. And animal sacrifice of puppies in particular was a practice in and around Athens in the classical Greek period. It was widely known throughout the ancient Mediterranean that dogs were the most sacred animal to Hecate, which I think we should talk about that for a little bit. I mean, the animal sacrifice can be kind of unsettling, but why dogs? Like
Yeah.
historically, who were dogs in ancient Greece? So, dogs in ancient Greece were pretty much like dogs of up to even today, I guess. Dogs were part of families, part of the household, part of the oikos. They performed important jobs within, whether it was on a farm and so on. So dogs were part of everyday life,
Mhm.
but they were definitely different than the rest of the domestic animals. Like they weren't sheep, they weren't chickens. They did have some chickens, but they weren't very big into chickens then. They weren't sheep, they weren't oxen. They had a really unique role because dogs weren't usually eaten. I don't know. Do you ever think about why dogs and Hecate?
I don't think I ever really have, but now I'm thinking about there were definitely guardians, and back to that whole juxtaposition of like the tame um and like compared to like this primal sort of wildness. And I think that there's something there about dogs, like between the tame and the civilized.
Right. And also
And
that they were
uh,
companions,
yeah.
like, and, this whole association with dogs and, the entrance to the underworld and so on. Like, it's
Yeah.
really fascinating to kind of think about why that might have been and exploring kind of the unique role of dogs within the structure of the household.
Hmm.
Like, you didn't eat them.
Hmm.
Um,
There's something too about the wail of a dog. Like I think that maybe dogs were like a sounding alarm, and you hear about that a lot, is like the howling of dogs. And there's something there too.
right. And the protection, like you mentioned, the protection that they offered,
Mhm.
which is different. You don't really expect like your oxen to protect your land. So dogs have a really unique relationship with humans as protectors, as companions. It starts to sound a lot like Hecate, right? When you
Mhm.
talk about a dog, it can be fierce, but most of the time it is quite companionable and so on. So in this article, I'll just read a couple of the excerpts I put up here. Such was Hecate when she came into Euripides' hands, a woman who in every sense suffered the kind of fortune that Homer calls konteros. As a tragic principle, she could not submit to any direct dog comparison. But Euripides meant to add one more child to her brood and then put her in a furious pursuit of that child's killer. And so he created a slight canine coloring, which culminates in a telling association with the Aranese dog. So, like the Aranese dog, I don't know, like if you haven't heard of who the Aranese were. So, the Aranese are the hounds of Hecate, basically. It's one way to describe them. So these are like Hecate's horde dogs, spirit dogs that are fierce, that have fire in their eyes and guard the gates of the underworld. These are these kind of dogs that this author is saying kind of this is the energy that gets created when Polyxena is killed. And we were talking about dogs as protectors earlier. So the dog of the Sema is a guardian who sits at a gate and keeps men safe, which is so much like Hecate.
Mhm.
It watches and warns of danger and is marked particularly as Hecate's algama because its eyes are not merely bright, but made of torch fire. Hecate too was Daduchus and Phosphoros, two titles that mean torchbearer or light bringer. And this is interesting, right? Because Hecate's dog has like this fierceness that sits on the ramparts and is guarding not just like the oikos or the home, but also the polis, the state. So there's this all this business with the Hecate's dog. So I don't know, I find that fascinating, and I do feel that bringing Hecate and into the end of the play in this sense where Hecuba becomes a dog, and a very specific type of dog, an algama with these torch eyes. I think
Mhm.
that's speaking to like redemption, but also I think in a way it's showing the tenderness of Hecate that was demonstrated, in the Persephone tale. And one of the things we talked about when we were preparing, because we knew we wanted to explore empathy as a big concept, and we looked at different myths and so on. And like Artemis, for example, is not really known for being incredibly empathetic. And I did a little bit of research, Kristen, on the origin of the word empathy. And that's only really been an English word for about 100 years.
Really?
So if I'm remembering correctly, it was a German word. And to translate it into English, they used Latin roots, right? Like, so empath, like to feel others.
Mhm.
But to the Greeks, like this whole idea of empathy was not a huge thing. And if we want to kind of explore empathy within this whole tale of Hecuba, I mean, it peeks out in many different ways. Like, for example, when Paris comes home with Helen, and Hecuba lets Helen stay, even if she doesn't really want Helen to stay, even if she thinks this is going to be bad, she has empathy for Helen as another woman and letting her to stay. So lets her stay, and Helen's choice to liberate herself from a marriage to Menelaus, who she didn't love. Like, Hecuba demonstrates understanding of that and lets her stay. What are some of the other empathy points that you find in this story?
Um, we didn't talk about this, but I know that it's something that you see throughout the story. Even you can see empathy in the attackers, like when Polyxena, her daughter, was sacrificed to Achilles, like she was sacrificed with honor. Um, and tears were shed. And I think even the man who killed her came back to um Hecuba and said, when she made this sort of like impassioned cry, the woe is me that we talked about at the beginning of this, like he
Mm.
said, your daughter said very similar things right before she died. Um, and it wasn't to say that they were like completely ruthless. And I think that's kind of a challenging but also important aspect of this too, that you can, I don't know, you can really mess some things up or really hurt people and still have empathy.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
I do know what
um,
you're saying, and I think it's important in the context of exploring like the Trojan myth,
yeah, yeah,
like to not, yes, the Greeks were ruthless and violent, and yes, this was really just all over a woman. But at the same time, like you said, like they did have some empathy, especially towards some of the Trojan women, but they were
Mhm.
also incredibly cruel to them.
Incredibly cruel. Yeah. And
So
then maybe
empathy,
usually in hindsight, also, you know.
uh, um, and then the empathy, I guess, of Hecate to after Hecuba was transformed into a dog, that Hecate came and took her on, because it's not clear in any of the versions who actually changed Hecuba into a dog to save
Mhm.
her from the stoning.
Mhm.
I mean, there's different endings to the story,
Mhm.
but this idea of empathy, like understanding that, the god, or even mercy, like, in the versions where the gods transform her into a dog, it's because like a human doesn't deserve that ending. And so she dies as a dog. It's very, very compelling,
Mhm.
this idea of like, why was that done? And it's almost like, is it to save the Greeks from having to see this mighty queen die this way? It's easier on their eyes if they think of her as a dog than the fallen mighty Hecuba, because again, Hecuba is this spirit that can awaken all of our fears. I think that would be a really powerful fear to the ancient Greeks, right? Is that if someone that powerful as her could be brought to nothing and stoned like the worst among us, then
Mhm.
what could happen to me? There's a lot of empathy. And the empathy Hecuba has for her family, obviously, not just Helen, but all of her children, and mourning their loss and understanding all of the lost potential, I think, and being able to hold space for her remaining children and all of the other Trojan women who were surviving at that time, and kind of being like a unifying spirit that they rallied around. I think there is empathy. And when we are exploring our greatest fears, or trying to like, what can we take away from exploring um Hecuba? I think one of the things that we can take away is that people are going through hard things, maybe not as dire as what happened in this story, but that we all have our sorrows to bear. And if we can just have a little bit of empathy and let other people have that, and not have unrealistic expectations of people, I think there's a lot there in terms of Hecuba, what we can take away from us. I did want to mention two books by the novelist Pat Barker on reclaiming the story of the women of Troy and Hecuba. I've read them both. They're really, really good. Very, very interesting reclaiming. If you liked Madeline Miller's Circe, you'll probably like these two books, The Silence of the Girls and The Women of Troy. And just offer those two novels to you if you're fascinated by Hecuba and all of the Trojan women, that you may want to connect with her more by reading these novels. There's so much to Hecuba. So let's close with a quote from The Silence of the Girls. As an act of radical reclaiming. I think that's what this whole conversation about Hecuba has been, is an act of reclaiming her story, reclaiming women's outrage, and not just women, but all the marginalized, all those who were subjected to the whims and the violence of the powerful, in
Mhm.
reclaiming Hecuba and putting her back on her throne and seeing her as this dog priestess of eternal Hecate. I think it's so beautiful. And I think it parallels our own reclaiming and becoming sovereign over in our lives. So there's a lot for us to take out of this. So let's end with this quote. We're going to survive our songs, our stories. They'll never be able to forget us. Decades after the last man who fought at Troy is dead, their sons will remember the songs their Trojan mothers sang to them. will be in their dreams and in their worst nightmares too. So hail to Hecuba and hail Hecate, of course, and to all of the Trojan women. May reclaiming them help us find some healing and overcoming of our own fears and feeling more empowered. Thanks so much for hanging out with us for this conversation. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Bye.